will high and the mighty will fall. There will be no power brokers, the wall of power will fall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. This is your host, Paul Metsa. Tonight we are celebrating the life and music of the great Spider John Koerner, longtime Minneapolis resident and a man I considered to be America's greatest folk singer. John passed away peacefully on May 18th in his home with his family by his side. He was also a hero, mentor, and friend of mine. This is the first of two episodes. Tonight we have folk and blues cat Charlie Parr, longtime Twin Cities folk singer Charlie Maguire, and record store owner, producer, and friend of John's, Mr. Mark Trehus. First up, we get caught up with Charlie Parr. I remember, we're going to talk about our hero, mentor, friend, Spider John Koerner here in just a little bit, because I know you miss him as much as I do, and were crushed by his passing as much as I am. But I remember, do you remember we did that Ashland Folk Festival 6-7 years ago with John and you and my harmonica player, Sonny Earl. I'll never forget Koerner. Sunday in Ashland, Wisconsin, all the liquor stores are closed. And occasionally I like to have a little taste before I go on for the throat. And I said, John, you don't happen to have a pint or half pint? And he had this, it would be the kind of pint that it was plastic that you would carry around when you're fishing, because if it fell overboard, it would float.
It would float.
And so he gave me a shot, and it was, all I can remember, it was cheap brandy and some sort of like maraschino cherry juice. And I said, John, what is it? He goes, I call that the Lower Manhattan.
Yeah, I know that one.
Let's talk, Charlie. Let's get right into it. When did you see, your new record, which is your 18th record you put out? My goodness gracious, that's like a record every other year you've been playing, called Little Son on Smithsonian Folkways. Of course, in honor of the great harmonica player Tony Glover, who held forth with Koerner and Glover for years. But let's talk a little bit about Spider John Koerner and where you saw him for the first time, and how much he's meant to you over the years.
Well, I moved up to the Twin Cities from Austin, Minnesota, in the 80s. I dropped out of high school in 1981, and spent another year, I think, bumming around Austin before I just took off. I got a room in the West Bank, right behind the Mixed Blood Theater.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Rent at that time was around $60 a month for the nice room in the house, not the crappy one. That was $30 a month. But anyway, I sprung for the nice one. But I could busk my way to $60 over the course of a month. But I landed on the West Bank, and I had been listening to all those old blues records my dad had for all of my life. But I hadn't, I didn't know about the West Bank. I didn't know about John and Tony and Dave. And I got turned on really fast when I moved there. I had friends like Baby Grant Johnson and Mike Nicolai who said, this is what you'll like,
Yeah.
So right away, Sunday night at the Viking Bar, there's John, and I was there with 6 other people.
Right.
And I, by that time I had gotten a hold of. Well, I think Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Been had just come out. I got a hold of that and started diving in, and it changed my life.
Yeah.
That night changed my life. I saw John. Wow. He walks in, puts his guitar case down, plugs his guitar directly into that board that would electrocute you half the time at the Viking.
Right. Oh, yeah, sure.
He didn't get electrocuted. He sat down. He played for like 4 hours.
Yeah.
Told jokes and played for just a few people that were there. Like
really funny guy.
It was hilarious.
Guy.
It was, and the songs were amazing, and the guitar playing was like nothing I'd ever seen done before in my life. And I was completely. I was in awe the whole night. And then my route after that was, every Sunday that John would be there, or wherever John would be, I would find him and go see him play. Thursdays, Dave and Tony were playing at the Times Bar on Nicollet. I'd go see them play. Friday night, Willie Murphy used to do those solo barrel house piano sets.
Ooh, that's my favorite Willie Murphy stuff. I mean, I loved him. I loved his songwriting. I loved all of his records. He was one of the best bass players in the world.
Absolutely.
When he played with Willie and the Bees. But for me, Willie, to distill what sort of his soul brother number one was at the 400 bar at Cedar Riverside on that piano.
And it was crowded. I would get a drink and find my way to that corner next to the jukebox.
Oh, yeah.
Because I could see the piano really clearly. I could hear everything. No one would really be bothering you. Sometimes Tony would show up and he would stand behind the bar and play harmonica. I was in heaven. It was just amazing. And then at that time anyway, through the 80s and the 90s, the West Bank, you could go down to the New Riverside Cafe and see Dakota Dave Hull or Phil Haywood.
Right.
Any number of people.
Sean Blackburn.
Yeah. You were playing around. It was just like
Cats on the Stars. We did 4 years of Tuesdays at the 400 bar, which is right in the corner. And then occasionally it was funny because I think we were making $150. It's good money for three guys, free drinks. So we turned it into a $300 gig like in the blink of an eye. Right. But occasionally we would take the tip jar and we'd run it up to Palmer's after we'd had a couple and run it around the bar. And people put money in, and finally somebody say, "Where's the band?" And we go, "At the 400. See you later."
Now I never thought of that's a good idea. We used to play at the Viking every Tuesday for a while. And we used to have, it was a regular occurrence. Someone would, they'd pass the tip jar, they'd bring it back up to the stage, they'd put it down, and then someone else would grab it and just walk out the front door with it.
It's the West Bank, whatever you needed was there to be had.
Right.
So you got to start to listen to John back then. The night at the Viking had changed your life. Years later, I have to say, Charlie, I mean, I remember the first time I saw John Koerner at Palmer's Bar. Now, I had Spider Blues back in about 72 or 73, and that cool picture of him on the cover with the shades, the Ray-Bans, and the cigar. Yeah. And then when I moved down to Minneapolis, 77 or 78, you'd hang out at Palmer's, and there was Dave Ray, there was Bill Hinckley, there was Judy Larson, there was Spider John Koerner. So I walked up to him one day, sat at the bar, offered to buy him a beer and a bump, and thinking about the record he did with Willie Murphy, the great Run and Jump and Standing Still, which your new record, Little Son, reminds me a lot of, by the way. And I said, John, of course, like trembling like any young musician meeting Koerner for the first time, or Ray even, or Glover, which was even a little scarier. But I said, John, are you ever gonna play with a band again? And he goes, he pauses and he says, anybody can play with me, he said, but I can't play with anybody else. And it was at that point, it was like, yes, master, I will go to the mountain now.
Right.
Be back in 6 months to tell you what I learned.
Oh, my God.
So, but what an honor. He gifted you his 12-string guitar.
Yeah, he did. Well, it was about a year and a half ago now. He called me up and he explained to me that the last time I saw John play in public was at Tony's memorial.
Right, me too.
I think that might have been the last time he played.
That was the last time he performed in public.
And afterwards, we're backstage together, and I was, I'm trying to articulate to the man, what him and Tony and Dave,
right,
and all these musicians meant to me, and I can't do it, obviously.
And I have called them for years the Holy Trinity.
Totally. And he said to me, well, I think I'm done. My friends are gone now.
Wow.
And I didn't, at the time I didn't really think too much about it. I tried to say something consoling. It was a hard night. It was an honor for me. It was a very hard night. But that was the last time I saw him play. And then I had seen him after that, and we'd talked for a little while, and he said he felt like his hands had Alzheimer's. His brain knew what to play, but he couldn't get his hands to shape what he wanted.
Right.
And he was an idiosyncratic guitar player.
Yeah.
He was a cipher. He was one of one, the way he played. So I figured that if he couldn't get it to sound like he wanted to sound, he was probably just going to stop.
Right.
And then he called me up a year and a half ago, and he said he didn't want these guitars just sitting around. He had 3 guitars. He had a 9-string that he had given away in New England, walked off the stage. He said he was quitting music forever, gave it to a guy in New England, and moved to Denmark. Right. And then years later, the guy shows up in Boise, Idaho, and gives it back to him.
I've heard that story. It's incredible.
I know. And so he had that one, which I think that one's at the Plow and Stars, hanging on the wall. His Epiphone is currently on display at Palmer's in that beautiful case they made for it. And then the third one was the Gretsch that had been a 6-string and had been converted in Florida to a 12-string.
Yeah.
And that's the one that he gave to me.
It must have just knocked you out.
I was completely flabbergasted.
Yeah. Tell us, before we ask you to play a song, Charlie Parr, just tell us about, if let's say a Martian came down from outer space and they go, Mr. Parr, tell us about American music in the sky, Spider John Koerner. How would you describe him to a complete stranger or an alien or whoever?
Well, it'd be tough without a knowledge of the history of music, because the thing that John taught me the most is, he's a walking embodiment of the folk process.
Yeah.
In everything.
Right. So
he's taking in folk songs and like masticating them and then reproducing them as Spider John songs.
Yeah.
The songs that he covered were so unique, and the way he wrote songs was so unique. There's really almost nothing else like it. But to me, he embodied what Pete Seeger said about folk music. Because he was an active participant in the process. Even the guitar, with all the modifications.
Yeah.
Nothing. These songs and guitars are all just like tools to get to the next step. When no one knows anything about John, that's kind of what I say. This is someone who is so unique. You kind of have to sit down and listen for a little while. You'll hear his influences, but it takes a little longer because he's completely disassembled, that Louis Armstrong version of St. James Infirmary blues that he does. He's the one that starts that CD you gave me. He disassembled that, and then suddenly it's a Spider John song.
Right. He did it all with so much authority. And God, I was thinking, Charlie, when he passed, like, how many times have I seen Spider John? I go, once a month for 40 years. I remember one of the simple pleasures. You lived on the West Bank. I spent a lot of time on the West Bank. One of the simple pleasures of my life would just be standing on the street watching Koerner walk across the street with his guitar in a case.
Yeah.
I just knew everything was right in the universe at that point.
Yeah.
I was down at Old Joe's Barroom on a corner up by the square. The drinks was served as usual. The usual crowd was there. On my left stood Big Joe McKennedy, whoa, yes, and his eyes was bloodshot red. He turned to the crowd around him, and these was the words he said. I went out to that St. James Infirmary, hey, and I saw my baby there. She was stretched out on a long white table. So sweet, so cold, so fair. Let her go, God bless her. Wherever she may be, she can search this whole wide world over. She will never find another man like me. When I die, please won't you bury me in my high top of Stetson hat. Put a $20 gold piece on my watch chain, so the gang will know I died standing pat. 6 gamblers to carry my coffin, a pretty girl to sing me a song, a boogie band a riding on the wagon to play as we roll along. Hanging out as she heard my story. Won't you give me another shot of booze? If anybody happens to ask you, tell them I got them gambler's blues. Let her go, God bless her. Wherever she may be, she can search this whole wide world over. She will never find another man like me.
Welcome back to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. This is your host, Paul Metsa. We continue our tribute to the great Spider John Koerner. Next up is Minneapolis folk singer Charlie Maguire.
Yeah, I came down here about 72. And, people then on the West Bank, you were in the club as soon as they knew. As soon as you stood on the stage at the Riverside Cafe,
Right.
It was Bill Hinckley and Judy Larson that got me on their stage, saying, "Oh boy, you got to hear this Charlie Maguire. He came to town, and boy, he's got some great songs." And oh, gee, it was embarrassing, but they're beautiful. They're beautiful people. But the thing that I wanted to mention about the boys is that they were in the audience, from like my second time on stage. Maybe not all three, not just John Koerner, Tony Glover, and Dave Ray, but one of them was, and they were there checking you out. And it didn't matter to them if you played the same music that they did. As a matter of fact, it was, I don't. But the fact that you were plying your trade, the fact that you were pushing your limits, the fact that you were trying to be an artist and a musician and a songwriter, that's the currency that they wanted to see you spending out there on the stage. And that I can't think of a single musician, Paul, that didn't have that same experience.
Oh,
maybe even some of the people you've interviewed today. I mean, they were on the scene.
I remember
scene.
I remember when Cats and the Stars would. We did 4 years of Tuesdays at the 400, and there was no bigger honor than to have Spider John in the audience, listening and having a beer and just being a good guy.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, the way I look at it is it was a marriage made in heaven with those three guys. I mean, they're all from the Twin Cities, whether they were all, actually born in Minneapolis, that's not what I mean. But they were all in the scene here from a very early age. I mean, I remember Tony talking to me about Dave Ray. He was still in high school at the Dinkytown High School, Marshall High School.
Playing Leadbelly at 16 years old.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, for me, I mean, I'm from New York. I hang out with, my wonderful friends at the June Apple Musicians Co-op. I mean, I got Dakota Dave from Fargo, North Dakota. I got Pop Wagner from Yellow Springs, Ohio. I got Bob Bowie from Omaha, Nebraska. You can build a friendship that way. But you really get tight when you're all from the same place. Just like you up on the range,
For sure, and playing a lot of the same clubs, coffee houses, and bars. Tell us, do you remember the first time you saw Spider John Koerner solo?
Yeah, I gotta say that was on Prairie Home Companion. I started with Garrison on the show about 1974, and with the second show, and by 75, 76, I wasn't on every week, of course, because I was a songwriter and not versatile enough to be used as a person in a band or anything. I just work alone, as you know. But I was on there, once a month. It seems like a lot. And when you're writing songs every, to play and premiere on a show like that, once a month was plenty. And I remember John being on one of the shows, and you'd get there for 3:30, 4 o'clock at the old Arts and Science Center in St. Paul, across from where the show ended up, the Fitzgerald Theater.
Sure.
And you'd be there and running through the rehearsals, and I remember one time John turned to me in the green room and he said, "Oh, gee, I can't go on stage with these shoes." And I looked down and John's wearing his regular, work boots, the 6-inch leather work boots like he always wore.
The Red Wings.
I got to do something about these shoes. Yeah. He says, "I got to do something about these shoes." And I said, "All right." And he pulled out a can of mink oil. This is the stuff you put on your shoes to kind of rejuvenate the leather and
waterproof them.
It waterproofs them too, And he's slapping this stuff on. He's lathering this stuff on his boots, Excuse me, I'm just dying over here. And, they're just glistening with goose grease, basically, But it didn't matter because John, just like all the other guys, were comfortable in their own skin.
Right.
They didn't care if it looked weird to somebody else. If it made sense to them, they went with it, And so many times that kind of honesty is missing in people in the business. But not with those guys. They were honest, they were comfortable, and they were comfortable of who they were, and they were comfortable with what they were putting out. And basically, you could take it or leave it, And most people who heard them were glad to have it, glad to hear them. So,
Charlie Maguire,
little things like that.
Talk about what a gentleman John Koerner was.
Yeah, I mean, soft-spoken. Of the three guys, I'd say I knew John the least. He was cordial, to me. He was, supportive, as I said. Soft-spoken. A lot of people say that about him. But once again, it was his casualness. Just being him, being John was what you got. Nothing more, nothing less.
Charlie Maguire, you are, a very, very great folk singer yourself, and also a historian, journalist, playwright. You wear many hats, and you usually wear a hat. But tell us how you think Spider John Koerner fits into the firmament of American folk music.
He'd be the last person to say that he fitted in, but we all know that he did. I'll tell you a quick story. When John came out with that album in, I think it was 73, called Folk Songs Like They Used To. It's just a collection of folk songs. Nothing. I don't think there's anything on that album that he wrote. I could be wrong because I haven't heard it in a long, long time. But that album, I'm telling you, Paul, made the rounds. So one day, I'm sitting in Lee Hayes' house in Croton-on-Hudson, New York. Lee Hayes.
And tell people who Lee Hayes is.
Yeah. Lee Hayes was a member of the Weavers. He was a running buddy with Woody Guthrie. One of his closest and best friends was Pete Seeger. They wrote "If I Had a Hammer" together, and Lee and Pete and were two of the Weavers, along with Fred Halleman and Ronnie Gilbert. And Lee was retired, pretty much, living off his royalties, mostly I Had a Hammer and a few other things. Probably about age 60. His health wasn't that great, but his house was open. You know, if you knew where he lived and you were into folk music, that's where you went. And he'd put you to work in his garden, or he'd put you to work washing dishes, or he'd put you to work cleaning windows. You know, he knew what it was to be a folk singer on the road with sometimes no place to go.
Right.
So I'm sitting in the house one day, and we're talking repertoire. And he says to me, he says, you know, Charlie, he says, when I was doing the Weavers, we didn't sing all of our own songs. We mixed it up with traditional songs. He says, you should try that. Lots of people do that, and it's very successful. And, and I said, okay, thanks, Lee, I appreciate that. I wasn't completely convinced. And then he turns and shows me John Koerner's album. He says,
I love it.
He says, I've been listening to this album. He says, Pete gave it to me. So Pete had heard it.
Wow. And
he says, this is what I mean. He says, he's from Minnesota, just like you. He's, but he knows what works. He's singing folk songs, that Pete and I sang. And he's putting his own spin on it. He says, you should try this too. So the lions of folk music knew who John Koerner was, and I'm talking now maybe 40 years ago.
Wow.
They knew what kind of a musician and that John was, and I'll tell you, brother, they respected it because he was right in line with what they were doing when they were his age.
Well, the frog went a-courting, he did right, The frog went a-courting, he did right. A sword and a pistol by his side, yes, He rode up to Miss Mouse's den, He rode up to Miss Mouse's den, said, please, Miss Mouse, won't you let me in, yes, He took Miss Mouse upon his knee, He took Miss Mouse upon his knee. He said, please, Miss Mouse, won't you marry me? Yes, I first must ask my Uncle Rat, I first must ask my Uncle Rat, and I'll see what he would say to that, yes, And Uncle Rat come riding home, Uncle Rat come riding home and said, who's been here when I've been gone? Yes, He laughed until he shook his side, Laughed until he shook his side to think his niece would be a bride, yes, Where will the wedding supper be, Where will the wedding supper be? Under the same old apple tree, yes, What will the wedding supper be, What will the wedding supper be? Now 3 green beans and a black-eyed pea, yes, Now the first to come was Mr. Moth, First to come was Mr. Moth, and he come to spread the tablecloth, yes, And the next to come was a bumblebee, The next to come was a bumblebee, and he come with a banjo on his knee, yes, And the next to come.
Welcome back to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. This is your host, Paul Metsa. We continue our tribute to the late, great Spider John Koerner. Next up is a longtime friend of John's and a record guy, Mr. Mark Trehus. We've got a great fella on the line today that was good friends with Spider John Koerner, released records by the man, as well as Koerner Glover, ran a record store called Treehouse Records for years, at 26th and Lyndale. Quite a record collector. I think he's got over 50,000 LPs stored somewhere in a secure location. But we're very honored to talk to him today, Mr. Mark Trehus. Mark, how are you this afternoon?
I'm doing okay, Paul. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I know the passing of Spider John Koerner has hit you hard as it has myself and lots of others. What, quickly before we get into your relationship with John in terms of putting out his records, what are you missing most about Spider John as we speak right now?
It's hard to put into words, but his just his presence in the Twin Cities and around town, in all the years that I've heard him play music, gone to see him, became friends with him. To me, he's kind of a yardstick of sorts for, my love of music, being, defining me as someone who lives in the Twin Cities. I'm feeling very inarticulate at the moment, but I can only say that, I just miss his presence. I'm kind of at a loss for words right now, Paul.
Well, he's, I describe him in my many conversations since he's passed as both a gentleman and a gentleman. He was just such a great guy to have a beer with or hang out with or a cup of coffee or share lunch. He was just really a sweet guy.
Yeah. Yeah, that he was, and very, very unpretentious. As we talked about earlier today, when you told me that you were going to be calling, if you ran into John at the bar or wherever, and you weren't aware of his musical legacy, it would not come up. He was very much an everyman, and as a folk artist, his he lived that. He wasn't the least bit pretentious. He was who he was, and again, I'm doing a terrible job at relaying my feelings here, but.
Can you tell us, Mark Trehus, the first time you heard John in person? I imagine you had the Koerner and Glover records, but do you remember the first time you either saw the three of them play live or the first time you saw Spider John Koerner play live?
Yeah, the first time I saw Koerner was with Willie Murphy. I'm pretty sure, my memory's a little foggy, but I'm pretty sure they warmed up Jefferson Airplane at the Minneapolis Auditorium when Run and Jump and still came out.
Cool.
Around 69 or so. And I had no idea who he was at that time, but shortly thereafter, I started connecting a lot of the dots because as a Dylan fan, in investigating and reading up on Bob, I came to realize, that, their history together in the Twin Cities and how John was the first guy to show Dylan how to, first guy to show Dylan a 12 string, first time he'd ever seen one. And, so as, through Dylan, I was like, oh, well, here's these local cats who maybe, are of some interest to me or would be. And, from that, from around 69 on, I became interested in them, started getting their records around then. And I think the first time I saw Koerner and Glover as a trio, gosh, I don't know. It had to be sometime in the early 70s or so. I remember shows at the Extemp. I think the three of them played together. and other venues. It's all kind of a blur, like that area is for me, if you know what I mean. I think you do. I do.
I do know what you mean, Mark Trehus. Tell us about what did you ever talk to John about his time with Bob Dylan?
Not a lot. I had him and some other folks over to my house to play a private tape that I got from Tony Glover that I haven't been allowed to circulate, and John was in the room. So this was from like 62 and 63, and so it was real interesting watching John respond to this 60-year-old tape of him being in the room and conversing occasionally with Bob on this tape, and you could just kind of see the wheels spinning a little bit as he tried to unravel those memories, and it was cool.
What now? Tell us about the records you put out for John and for Koerner and Glover.
Sure. I first started, getting to know those guys. I knew John, and we talked, exchanged conversations over the years, but I didn't really know him as well as I got to know first Tony Glover and then Dave Ray. That started in the early 80s, I guess, when we certainly exchanged words in the past, all three of us, but, particularly with Tony rather, and Dave. And let me see, I'm losing my train of thought here.
Records you did with Koerner and Glover and John Koerner.
My records. Yeah. So, as I got to know Tony, and I would go and see he and Dave play, and this was a fairly low point of their visibility and career, I would say, as an acoustic entity, because they would play in the basement at St. Anthony, Maine, and this is like 86, 87, and I remember, and we taped the show. Stefan Kren brought his portable gear down there, and that all started because Tony was in my record store, and I'd seen those shows, and Tony told me they were going to wrap it up because they weren't well attended. And I said, well, gosh, we should tape a show for posterity and maybe make a record. And he, much to my surprise, because I thought those guys were way out of my league, he and Dave got very excited about it, and that, and so I put out a record called Legends in Their Spare Time on my Treehouse label. And that was recorded live at St. Anthony, Maine. And you can tell not many people are in the audience, because sometimes after the songs you hear like a solitary hand clap or two. But anyway, one thing led to another where although these records didn't come out on my label, I produced two for Dave Ray and Tony Glover for Rough Trade. Well, first one was for Rough Trade, and that was called Ashes of My Whiskey, and I believe that was around 89 or so. And then another one called Picture Has Faded. And those came about because, the Rough Trade thing came about because Lucinda Williams had been in my record store and was combing through the records and saw the Koerner and Glover section. She goes, "Oh, Koerner and Glover, I love these guys. I grew up with them." And I said, "Oh, really?" And I said, "Well, I know those cats, and they're still around, still knocking around." And she said, "Do you think they want to come see my show tonight?" And Tony elected to go down there. I told him to bring his harp, and he says, "You better not let me embarrass myself here," because he had no idea who Lucinda was. And so he got up, and it was Lucinda and Oscar was on guitar, and I was, as per Peter Jesperson's idea. Tony got up for the encore and started playing harp, and then they just started doing all these blues things, Memphis Minnie and Little Son Jackson, and Lucinda and Tony just really hit it off. So getting back to the story about how the records came about, Lucinda came back to town, and Robin Hurley, who was the American A&R guy for Rough Trade, flew in for the show because Lucinda got popular here virtually, before she exploded. She became popular here largely as a result of Peter Jesperson's fandom and Steve McClellan flying her into town. So Robin flew in for the show, and Ray and Glover warmed up, and Lucinda's like, "You got to catch these guys." And then Robin offered him a deal on the spot, and at that time they were going to do another record for me. And Tony and Dave rather said, we're getting away from Koerner here, but
it's all right.
Yeah, but they're like, well, we were going to do the record with you, but how about you produce it and we'll give you a share of the royalties. And I was just, what a generous thing. So that's how those records came about. But then getting back to Koerner, I produced a reunion record called One Foot in the Groove that we recorded at Bryant Lake Bowl, and selected the best songs from, and that came out on a label called Pin Kerr Records, and that label went belly up like the week that record was released. It was just a disaster, in terms of distribution, and so.
But Mark didn't have a nice blurb on that record from Bob Dylan himself.
Yeah. I'm friendly with Bob's manager, Jeff Rosen, and I thought, well, it's not going to hurt to try. So I sent a copy of the performance of the record before it came out to Jeff, and then another copy for Bob. And I said, pass this on to Bob, see if he'd be willing to make a comment for publicity purposes. And Jeff says, well, he doesn't normally do these kinds of things. And I said, yeah, I know, but what the heck, at least you'll get to hear it. 2 weeks later, Jeff calls me and says, hey, I got a quote for you. And I remember the quote exactly. Bob said, amazing, exactly like you'd think it would be every time they play The Stars Shine.
Mark Trehus, we've got about 1 minute left. Why don't you tell us, how would you describe how Spider John Koerner fits into the American history of American folk music and rock and roll?
That's a great question. I've always maintained that John is one of the preeminent folk artists in America. And other than, Ramblin' Jack Elliott, who, as far as I know, is still with us, I always considered him and John like the two most important purveyors of American folk music in the country. And John, in particular, as a Minnesotan, and John has spent most of his life here, he added his own. There's nobody like John. Nobody played guitar like him. Nobody sang like him. Nobody had a presence like him. He brought something to those songs that was entirely his own, singular, and nobody can copy it. Charlie Parr does a darn fine job, but there'll never be anybody like Spider John Koerner. He and with all respect to the obituaries that have been done about him that refer to his influence on Dylan and how Bowie and John Lennon and whatnot were friends or fans, nobody's talking about what a great artist John was. John was an incredible artist. He's an icon of American folk music and a hero of mine, and I'm just so proud to have worked with him and put out records by him and become his friends. I'm going to miss him greatly, as I know you will too, Paul.
Thank you very much, Mark Trehus. I look forward to seeing you, and I'm going to pick up those. Save a disc of all of those that I don't have. I'll buy them when I see you. But thanks for your time this evening, and God bless you who were able to have so much time with the great Spider John Koerner, Mark Trehus. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for inviting me on your show, Paul. Love you, buddy.
Love you too, brother. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the Wall and Power Radio Hour. Next week, we are also going to have the second episode in our tribute to the late, great Spider John Koerner. This episode is brought to you today by Grumpy's Northeast and Palmer's Bar on Cedar Avenue, who will be hosting a potluck starting at 5 p.m. after Spider John's celebration of life at the Caboose Bar on Sunday, June 23rd. We'd also like to thank Wooley's American Guitars, selling used and new guitars and amps in their new location by the Como Zoo. Find them at Wooley'sAmericanGuitars.com. We'd also like to thank Hi-Fi Hair and Music, Lousy Service, Mediocre Hair, and Loud Music. They're located right by Loring Park. Thanks for the support. You can follow me at paulmetsa.com. Once again, the celebration of life for Spider John Koerner will be Sunday, June 23rd at the Caboose Bar on the West Bank, starting at 1 p.m. And remember, like my dad used to tell me, always be kind and make someone happy.
Billy Owens have told his wife to do something wrong, but it run for the lives of the boys. Well, shooting it up that thing. Well, they took him all away, now I put him in the jail.